So I want to do an analysis now of one of the oldest arguments for why a country might want to open itself to international trade. It actually goes back to Adam Smith, who was writing in a time in the 18th century when many governments would support the creation of a domestic monopoly inside the country. And Adam Smith argued against this. And so while he didn't use these specific graphs, the basic analysis is there. And so here's going to be the first example of where we see that relaxing this assumption of perfect competition doesn't undercut some of the basic arguments for trade. So to do this, we're going to be looking at a situation where there is a domestic monopoly, not because there are any inherent benefits or cost advantages to the domestic industry, but instead the government, for whatever reason, has restricted the entry of other domestic firms or international firms in the market. We're going to make a simplifying assumption that is just for ease, which is that the domestic marginal cost of production is equal to the foreign marginal cost of production. So we're not going to be looking at a situation where the domestic or the foreign firm have any cost advantages. They're going to be just the same. Again, the arguments are quite similar if you relax that assumption. So in autarky, we will analyze this with a standard demand curve for the domestic economy. And because it's a monopoly, they will take a, or the domestic monopoly will take a look at the marginal revenue associated with an extra unit of sales. So we've got a marginal revenue curve associated with this domestic demand. And for ease, we're going to assume that there is a constant marginal cost and that there are no fixed costs. So the cost structure is very simple, and what we have here is that the domestic monopoly will choose to produce where marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, where these two lines meet, and take a look at the monopoly price associated with that. And what we see is that the domestic firm will certainly charge a price that is greater than its marginal cost of production, restricts output in order to get the price up. So first, let's take a look at the profits of the domestic industry. Because we have assumed that there are no fixed costs and marginal costs are constant, this box represents the initial profits in the domestic monopoly. That's area B. That's that entire box. So B represents the initial autarky domestic monopoly profits. There's some consumer surplus associated with that because consumers like to get some of this product even if it's restricted. Now let's imagine that a foreign firm is allowed to operate in this market. In fact, that there are many foreign firms so that it's a competitive situation in the world market. And as we noted, we'll assume that the world marginal cost of production equals the domestic. And because there are perfectly competitive markets in the world market, that is indeed the world price. So now the domestic monopolist has to look at the prospects that the foreigners will be able to undercut if it tries to sell at any price above its marginal cost. In fact, that world price is going to be the relevant price in the domestic market. If this is a homogeneous good, domestic consumers would just as soon buy from the foreigners as to the domestic firm. That is going to drive the price of this product down in the domestic market to where the world price is. Now, at that world price, you're going to have consumption equal that amount right there, the free trade quantity of production. And you will then have some impact on the domestic and consumers and producers. Okay, so first let's look at the impact on the monopolists. So this is a situation where the domestic firm can no longer charge a price higher than the international price. Now this gets a little bit tricky because if the costs are the same, we really don't know how much the domestic firm will produce. We don't know how much will be imported in the end because they're charging this at the same price. But what we do know is that whatever the profits were are going to be gone. So let's make a simplifying assumption. Let's suppose that the domestic firm actually increases its production in reaction to the foreign monopolists or foreign competition. So let's say that the domestic firm now produces that free trade quantity demanded by domestic consumers. Now this need not be the case, but this is just one example. If that were the case, then what you would have is that you would have increased domestic production, potentially with greater domestic employment, but B, the profits that used to be earned by the monopolists are gone. So B is lost to the domestic monopolists. It's gone. So even though production may have gone up, those profits go away. Now, note, if the domestic monopolist is completely priced out or completely leaves the market, goes down to zero quantity produced, they still lose B. So it doesn't matter how much they produce, they lose those profits associated with the higher price. Okay, so B is a loss to the domestic economy. Now how about the consumers? Now the consumers are affected by seeing a lower price in the domestic market, and they're going to have an associated increase in consumer surplus. That is the area defined by the change in the price over to the demand curve. So AB is gained by consumers. So here we have these two effects, as is often the case in an international trade example. We have a gain for one group in the domestic economy and a loss in the other. So how do we assess that? It's back to the same comparison. If we consider a transfer from one group to another as having no effect, so in this case, some of the consumer surplus gain, B, was taken essentially out of the pockets of the domestic monopolist. That has no welfare effects using the welfare calculus that we have developed. But what you do have is a net gain of A. A is the excess of consumer surplus gain over the producer loss inside the domestic economy as a consequence of the lost profits. A are the consumers that are now priced into the market, if you will. That's a consumer surplus gain associated with new consumers who can now buy this product because of the international competition. So, one final thing to note here. The presence of the international competitor this international market where we can buy as much as we want to at the world price, essentially gives us an outcome which mimics what would happen if we had perfect competition inside the domestic economy. That is to say, in the end, price equal to marginal cost at this point. So even though we might continue to have only one domestic monopoly inside, or one domestic firm inside the domestic economy, the presence of the international competition will completely eliminate the ability of that domestic monopoly to take advantage of its situation as the sole supplier, because it's not the sole supplier anymore. You've got this international competition. So, in the end, changing the assumptions that we have a domestic monopoly inside the domestic economy does not change the essential argument for why you might want to import a product if it's cheaper, or can be sold in the foreign market cheaper than you had originally in the domestic market. And in the case of a domestic monopoly, the international competition completely eliminates the ability of that domestic monopoly to take advantage of its monopoly position inside the domestic economy.